Okay, in the interest of time, I am not going to go into the very prestigious bio of all of our afternoon session panelists today, except to say that they are all highly respected and published authors in these areas. Yahya Saeed and James Russell both have book volumes, one coming out and one that's recently come out in this area of sort of national resource curse and oil and militarization and oil, resource conflict. David Mares is our scholar for energy studies in Latin America and a professor at University of California, San Diego. And Ron Saligo is one of our resident energy economists, and Dr. Rick Stoll is one of the premier professors at Rice looking at international conflicts. So I'm going to ask everybody to go 20 minutes each, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion and Q&A with the audience. Dr. Mares, my apologies, has to leave a little bit early to catch a plane for his daughter's graduation? Son's graduation. So he'll be leaving a little bit early, but looking forward to the panel session. David, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you, Amy. And I want to thank Amy and the Baker Institute for the opportunity to be here with you today. I'll be looking at Bolivia, but Bolivia as a case to help us understand some of the internal dynamics of what goes on in countries that have that are natural resource rich. This is a paper that I wrote the political science part, and then Peter Hartley and Ken Metlock helped me out by running their gas model to look at the implications of policy changes in Bolivia. So if you look at the whole paper on the website, you'll get the gas model as well. But I'll just be talking about the poli-sci part. I think we should begin sort of to offset a little bit of what was said this morning by Reuben Jeffrey. We can't think about economic policy as if it were disconnected from politics. When I hear people say, well, they should understand and wait, in the short term they pay these benefits, and in the medium and long term they'll get benefits. They're usually talking about developing countries when they say that. We in the United States can't make short-term adjustments to do something that will benefit us in the long term or medium term because it's too costly for us to make them in the short term. So we need to understand that energy politics takes place in a context made up of historical and contemporary relationships. We may be interested in the consequences of a particular set of policies that determine national output and trade, but those policies, we have to understand why they were chosen. They're not just wacky policies. They have a reason for being. So the political economy of energy is a subset of the politics of governing. I'm going to give you some very easy graphs to look at to try and get across a point about governing. And governing is building coalitions, bringing people together who have different interests. It also means excluding some people. And at different points in time, who's in and who's out is stable. At other points in time, it's not stable. So I just want to point out here in this, whoops, maybe I just got a bad view here because of, you can see it? Oh, all right. Well, up here, this is the national boundary here. This is what's called the ruling coalition. It's made up of a number of different groups here. Some of those groups can be international groups. That's this item here that goes across. These are the excluded parts of society in lots of the countries that we're interested in with natural resources. The ruling coalition is quite small, and the excluded parts of the society are quite large. You can see there's some overlap. These groups have interests in common. These groups don't have interests in common with these groups, except that they're excluded. All right, so that's a typical exclusionary coalition when we start looking at this. Here's another exclusionary coalition. It's the new exclusionary coalition, somebody from the old excluding coalition has moved over here. Usually it's the intelligentsia will move over, form part of the new coalition. And there'll be people in the old coalition who are on the outs. And in this case, it could be somebody who had international presence as well, is no longer included here. Notice the new ruling coalition doesn't always include everybody who was excluded. It can exclude some of the previously excluded. All right. I'll argue when I look at the Bolivian case that you went from here to here with Morales. There was an effort to do something in Bolivia that is what is recommended. All right, so we have two exclusionary coalitions, one small, one large. Here is a stable ruling coalition after social mobilization, in which the old ruling coalition incorporates a number of segments that were excluded into the ruling coalition, and you get reform of that coalition, and it's stable. Okay. Notice it doesn't include everybody. Okay, but it includes enough groups that you can now have a stable government. All right. In Bolivia, they attempted to do this in the 1990s, and a lot of the story of that I'm going to tell you is why this didn't work, and we wound up with this instead. So this is Morales, Evo Morales, and this is largely identified with President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, who was overthrown by street riots because he failed. Okay, so in the 1980s, liberal democracy took root in Bolivia. Bolivia is a poor and racially polarized society. The core of the ruling coalition in Bolivia were the political parties. Okay, the political parties basically used government as patronage distribution. Okay, the parties didn't represent forces in society. We go back to that original picture. They're excluded, but you've got democracy and you've got parties and they run for election and they get elected. Okay, but they're using the government basically to reward their supporters. There's a new private sector in Bolivia in this period, domestic and foreign private sector, and they're doing quite well. But one of the things that they are not doing is they're not generating employment opportunities. Okay, it's not about whether they're getting richer, inequality is growing. It's that inequality is growing and they are not generating employment opportunities. Okay, who's excluded in this? The old miners' unions are excluded. The coca growers are excluded. The indigenous are excluded. The indigenous people in Bolivia had been attempted to be incorporated into modern Bolivia by turning them into westernized peasants, not indigenous people, but poor farmers. Essentially, a peasant is a poor farmer, thinks and acts like poor farmers anywhere in the United States or in Europe. And indigenous people in Bolivia were expected to conform to that kind of a view. The poor and the peasants under liberal democracy who were incorporated as subjects. You know, government represents you. We do this for you. We do this to you. But they weren't participants in that policy making. They had no impact on policy making. So in that sense, they weren't empowered by the political system. In the 1990s, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada spearheaded a number of really interesting and innovative reforms in Bolivia. First as Minister of Planning, then as President. In his first term, you couldn't be re-elected consecutively in Bolivia, so he had to sit out a term before he came back as President. His mantra was basically incorporate and empower. Okay, we need to bring these people into the system and empower them. What he meant by empowering them was give them the opportunity to act as I expect them to act. Okay, so the indigenous were given constitutional rights. Bolivia became a multinational, plurinational nation. His vice president in his 1992 campaign was an indigenous person. That was revolutionary in Bolivia, that you would have an indigenous vice president. So Goni's his nickname. So he looks like this really interesting person who's going to make these big changes. He passes a number of laws on political participation, on decentralization, and it's basically designed to empower the local communities, what are called municipios in Brazil, roughly counties in the U.S. He gives them budgets. He insists that they get organized in order to receive a budget. So you can see that as, wow, he's organizing people at the local level. And then he doesn't carry out privatization, which was in the rest of Latin America. Basically, you just sell the assets. He came up with a scheme that was called capitalization. So we're going to sell these state-owned assets to the private sector. They'll be able to buy 51% of the assets. The other 49% of the assets of the state-owned enterprise will go into a pension fund for Bolivians. When the foreign capital buys these firms, they also have to pledge to reinvest in the companies. So it's not that you can buy, in Argentina with Menem, you bought the companies and you basically took all the assets out of them and didn't put anything into it, and that was the story. But Goni saw that process as potential in Bolivia and set it up so they couldn't do that. So the operational control went to the private sector, and the private sector, through this process, essentially began funding a pension fund system in Bolivia that down the road promised something for Bolivians 65 years and older. Yet, by 2000, the liberal democratic state began to collapse. So the question is, well, what went wrong? Goni's ideas look great. What went wrong? Well, you got hypermobilization against the liberal democracy for a variety of reasons. The newly incorporated Bolivians demanded power to affect decisions. Okay? When Goni talked about incorporating and empowering, what he meant was, I'm going to incorporate you, so you're going to get some of the benefits, and I'll tell you what you need to do, and then you have the power to do that. So you have the power at the local level to distribute the budget for these programs that I tell you have to do. And it turned out that Goni's vision of Bolivia really wasn't a vision that actually meshed well with the Bolivian reality. I mean, he was thinking of Chile, he was thinking of the United States. He wasn't thinking about a country where 2/3 of the population, roughly, was living in poverty. They can't really wait for the long term. Pension benefits are great if you can make it to 65, but when the average age in the country is only about 65, it doesn't seem all that rewarding. These hypermobilizations created distinct oppositions to the government, okay, but you got a coalition of these distinct oppositions over a period of time that wound up posing a major challenge to the government. The coca growers' leader, Evo Morales, was able to pull together almost all of that opposition. He didn't pull together the departments of the states in a new coalition to create a new political system. So let's look a little bit more closely at the specific demands of these different groups. There are different groups, and this is going to be a problem for Morales. It is currently a problem for Morales, but it's what allowed Goni to be overthrown. In 2000, you had what was called a water war in a major city in Bolivia. It was sort of the sounding bell. The sounding bell not only of the limits of Goni's reforms, but also the sounding bell of we can defeat this. All right? The water war was essentially an effort to deal with the fact that the current municipal water system in the city of Cochabamba was a disaster. It couldn't deliver water. Goni said, we're going to privatize the water distribution system. We're going to sell it to Bechtel subsidiary. Goni wasn't president in 2000. Another person was president, but he had started the process. Goni had empowered the local municipalities, and the municipalities had said, we don't want to sell it. Now that we have a budget, and now that we have rules about how that budget can be used, and now that our people are empowered, we want to give a shot at running the local municipal water district, and we should have that opportunity. But the president said, no, you don't have that opportunity. Privatization of the water system is the national policy, so we are going to privatize that. And they sold it, and the company came in, and there were lots of different things that were going on, and ultimately, after the company raised water rates, you got street riots. All right, so the street riots forced the government to go back on selling the company. Bechtel wound up giving it back to the government. Another thing that happened in 2000 where indigenous people suddenly became major players as indigenous people, not as peasants, but as indigenous peoples. They came together and they said, not all of them, but lots of them came together in different groups, and they said, you know, now that we have these rights as Aymara and whatnot, you know, we want to see those things translated into reality. And they began to demand to be treated as separate cultural entities and communities. Then the coca growers came together and had been demanding that the government recognize coca is not cocaine. Okay, coca is a plant that has lots of different purposes attached to it. Cocaine is one of them, and they wanted the government to recognize the distinction between coca and cocaine and permit the growing of coca. The departments, the states, they wanted autonomy. The president had appointed the governors. The states don't have a state legislature. Goni had tried to get around the departments, the states, by empowering the local municipalities and therefore weakening departmental identity. But that didn't work, and you got this movement in Bolivia for more autonomy at the departmental level. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the big gas state, Santa Cruz, held a referendum, non-binding referendum, but it held a referendum on whether they should be autonomous or not, and they won with 85% of the vote. And then ultimately you got the gas trade issue tied in with all of these other issues. And the gas trade issue is really an issue about the distribution of rents associated with gas, as is usually the case when we talk about natural resources. The gas trade rent issue is how you distribute that rent among party elites, foreigners, and poor Bolivians. Okay, so let me look a little more closely at the gas conflict. I've set up that there are lots of things going on there, but gas we're going to look at. Gas is what draws the attention. It's the focal point for all of this opposition. In 2003, there was a gas war. It's called the gas war because 2000 was the water war. In 2003, Goni was back as president, and he had intended to sell natural gas via Chile to Mexico and via Mexico to the United States. There were riots in the street. A number of people were killed, and the president had to resign and flee to the United States. The new president who came in called for a gas referendum. The gas referendum was basically to give democratic validation to what had happened through riots. And the referendum passed overwhelmingly and agreed with all of the demands of the people who had rioted, which were change the gas regime. Okay, so gas policy changed. In 2005, there was a hydrocarbons law, which now said that production, not just reserves, but production was the property of the state. Distribution was controlled by the states, and local communities, read indigenous there, were given veto over production. You want to produce in a local community, you have to meet what the local community wants in order to produce there. These changes went part of the way of what people wanted, didn't go all the way. There were more riots, more deaths. Another president resigned. In 2006, you got gas nationalization of exploration and production. What they mean by nationalization in Bolivia is control goes to the state. Doesn't mean 100% ownership, all right? In 2008, you get gas nationalization of distribution and transportation. And in 2008, there may be a new constitution which would rewrite the hydrocarbons law and change things around. So what are the consequences of all of this? Consequences are uncertainty. Uncertainty means less investment. So you see investment in the gas sector drops dramatically over time as the state begins to disintegrate. The consequences in investment also have consequences for exploration. So exploration goes down. Consequences for production are that production levels off. We know Bolivia has a lot of gas. They had drilled a number of wells, so they've got production there, but the production is leveling off. You can see that there had been this dramatic increase in production, and now it's leveling off. And the result of all of that is that Bolivia's ability to export gas has decreased dramatically. That has implications for Brazil. It has implications for Argentina. It has implications in the future for Chile. It has some implications for the gas trade. We're not talking about big users of gas, but they are going into the world LNG market as it's developing. And so that's another source of demand on that LNG market. Let me conclude with a couple of points about this. Obviously, I didn't go through the details of the different governments. It's in the paper, but in a few minutes I can't spend time on the details, so I was trying to give you the basic points here. Reforms, to conclude, 3 points. Reforms of the old exclusionary systems are not sufficient to create domestic stability around expectations concerning energy rents. Lots of times, whether it's the World Bank or the U.S. State Department, they'll say, well, you know, we just need to reform this government and we'll solve the problems with the resource curse, et cetera, et cetera. You need more than reform. Incorporation of the previously excluded needs to be accompanied by their empowerment to affect government policy. Reform without that empowerment is simply more imposition on those people, and now those people have some degree of power because they have been incorporated into the system. Therefore, energy policy promises, I promise you'll do better if you let us export energy. Those promises have to be carefully crafted to be credible. What do I mean by carefully crafted? It's not just a case of whether the institutions are transparent and accountable. Okay, that's everybody's mantra about beating the resource curse, is transparency and accountability. It's not just that. You also need to have direct links to improve the lives of the newly empowered people. Okay, corporate social responsibility is a good way to approach it before hypermobilization. Hypermobilization means we need the stuff now. Corporate social responsibility is a slow improvement in local conditions. Okay, but when you have hypermobilization, which results in riots in the streets, overthrow of presidents, revolution and implantation of a new political system, that stimulates nationalism, and nationalism means these are our rents, we want improvement now. So you have to have, in that kind of a situation, you have a direct link which has to go through the government and provide benefits to the people. In the short term, that's a bad situation for energy partners, but in the medium to long term, it's the only way to get from a situation of hypermobilization and democracy into cooperative relationships in the medium term. The alternative would be to demobilize the people in the streets, and the only way to do that is through authoritarianism, and that creates a whole different dynamic. So, thank you.
Doing by itself, yeah, it's amazing. Well, I was sitting there counting. I found at least 7 people sleeping, so that's good. A good start. This is a map of the so-called Red Line Agreement, which was signed at the end of the waning days of World War I. And it's the concession area for the Turkish Petroleum Corporation. I'm using this map to begin the lecture because it epitomizes, it's the very symbol of the geopolitics of oil. The Turkish Petroleum Corporation was owned 1/3 each by one of what one could loosely call the predecessors of Exxon, BP, and Total, with 5% going to Gulbenkian. And as you see, the concession area is quite big, and it includes basically all the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The other significance of this map actually is a more subtle one, which is that out of this company, out of this concession agreement, emerged the new states that we see today in that region, actually. And that agreement, that deal, that concession agreement, was the foundation for the creation of these states, of many of these states in this region. And this map then appeals to the ambiguity, actually, of the relationship between oil geopolitics and state formation in that region. It's not only, as some would suggest, a destructive relationship whereby geopolitical competition is leading to war and state collapse, but it could also play a role, a constructive role, if you like. And we've seen that in this region before, and we may see that in the future as well. The issue of the link between the war, the events in Iraq since over the last 5 years and oil keeps coming back and forth. Most recently, it's been highlighted again. Allegedly, Ambassador Crocker, after his testimony at the Senate, met privately with senators and told them that if the U.S. withdrew precipitously from Iraq, then oil prices will go very high, will rise, suggesting that there is a link between the U.S. continued presence in Iraq and oil. There was also similar comments attributed to John McCain, and of course this is music to the opponents of the war and the opponents of the U.S. Staying in Iraq, suggesting that it's immoral to continue with this enterprise for the sake of oil. And here you see the danger of this argument, because it's actually supported by two opposing ends of the debate, and also it's very, if you like, for lack of better words, it's a very sexy argument. We're there. This is a war that is very easy to explain. There's oil. We're running out of oil, and therefore we have to go and fight for it. And some think it's wrong, and some think it's right. But the bottom line is, it's a very straightforward argument. Amy alluded recently to a discussion she had with peak oil proponents. That sort of adds spice to the whole debate, because then if we add to it that oil is actually running very dangerously low, then the intensity of these competitions becomes even higher. I would like to argue that this is an unhelpful way of approaching these conflicts, of approaching petroleum geopolitics. And it's unhelpful because it's actually further endangers the supply of oil. It's counterproductive in terms of producing a security of energy supplies. And it also further jeopardizes stability in these countries and produces more conflict. And part of the reasons for the changing role of geopolitics in oil is the changing nature of states, changing nature of conflict, basically the more changing role of the state and its monopoly on force and monopoly on oil rents. The arguments that I will be advancing are based on a study we carried at the LSE over the last almost 10 years, looking at 6 conflict zones where there is oil. And we were not looking at any causal relationship or any sort of sequential relationship between oil and conflict, but looking at the interaction. If there is a conflict in an area, in a place where there's oil, what is the dynamic of this relationship? And I will summarize in brief the conclusions of this study in terms of theoretical ways, and expose them on the example of Iraq, which is what I've been looking at most closely. Basically, we're looking at the interaction between oil and conflict at several levels. And these levels reflect different forms of competition over oil rents between the various sets of actors. As it happens, these interactions also happen over various historical moments. So there's a sort of an overlap, or there's a matrix of relationships here between competition over rents between various actors and also in different historical periods. So at the first level, there is the geopolitical competition over oil, and that's competition over oil rents and oil supplies between states, and it's usually competition between superpowers. So the Red Line Agreement is an example of that, is when superpowers come together to decide to divide or to share or to somehow distribute resource rents. And this is one element, if you like, of China's attempts today at trying to get a piece of the resource rents and access to supplies of oil in Africa is another example of that. The other level, and that happens sort of sequentially to that. I mean, that was the era of the big five, the big oil companies. That was the era of the Turkish Petroleum Corporation before nationalizations. After nationalizations, once nationalizations take place, you get into the petro-state era of interactions or competition over resource rents, where the competition is between state and society, or the competition over resource rents affects the relationship between state and society. And this is what leads to the emergence of petrostates, or what often people refer to as the resource curse, and I'll refer to that in more detail later on. The next level of competition is between non-state actors or sub-state actors, and that happens when you see the breakdown of the monopoly of the state over coercive power, coercive force, and the breakdown of the state's monopoly over resource rents, which was established in the previous stage. And when that starts breaking down, then oil suddenly becomes lootable and becomes a sort of a source of a greed and grievance type competition for those rents. Chechnya is a good example of that, or any other examples of people siphoning off pipelines and stealing oil, oil becoming a lootable resource. And then, apart from all those where oil sort of competition over resource rents is destructive or state unbuilding, there are mitigating circumstances because oil, because of some of its characteristics, does require a modicum of a rule of law to keep the rents flowing, and that acts as a brake to the state unbuilding forces or to the forces that lead to conflict. And I will refer to that then in more detail later on. So all these competitions are derived from particular features of oil, and I'm not going to dwell on those because I suspect that everyone here is quite familiar with this. I will just quickly run through them. I mean, the main, of course, element that drives rent-seeking are rents, which are the extraordinary profits created by oil. And they have very strong implications about the relationship to labor, the relationship to power in countries depending on oil rents. And so it's the main characteristic. The second is the fact that it is a strategic commodity, although not as significant today as it was in the 30s or 40s, but nonetheless is still a strong source of energy supplies. It's a very volatile commodity. The prices of oil have been more volatile than the prices of any other commodities. It's a capital-intensive commodity, as in there is a requirement for a minimum degree of law and order to allow the rents to flow. It's not like diamonds or some other lootable resources. The capital intensity also means that there is no labor constituency to appease the labor force that is needed to produce oil is very small. Iraq this year will produce $70 billion worth of oil with a labor force engaged in oil production of less than 20,000 people. It's an enclave activity that can survive in separation from the rest of the society, in seclusion from the rest of society with very little interaction. And it's depletable, which means that there is an added intensity to the competition over resource rents, because if you don't do it today, it will be over tomorrow. And this depletability is not necessarily about running out of oil, but could be also about oil becoming less of an economic resource in the future when it becomes obsolete. So if we take these two components, these sets of interactions and the special features, what we get is what we call in the book the rent-seeking cycle. And this is a cycle that could be observed on many of the oil-dependent countries, and I will go through it on the example of Iraq, with Russia also in the background, because these are the two studies I've addressed, but I'm sure many of you will recognize parallels with other states and other petroleum-dependent states. The first stage is the state building stage, and we've seen that in Iraq and the aftermath of the Red Line Agreement. We've seen that in Azerbaijan in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when external and internal forces conspire to create, to build, to strengthen the state, so if for nothing else, to have a contractual party, to have somebody who you can get the concession with, and so to allow for the petroleum to flow. There's a positive conspiracy to create an entity that will allow the oil to flow. Something like that could be observed in Iraq today, that there is suddenly people have realized that more oil actually could be extracted and more rents could be made available for everyone if Iraq was more stable. And some of that conspiracy is producing some more stability in Iraq today. Iraq had that period extended into the 50s, and there were policies in place that tried to keep the rent seeking and their competition over rents at the minimum. There was a very successful program of the Iraq Reconstruction Board that kept the bulk of oil revenues and rents outside the economy and outside the control of the state, and only injected them into the economy in a very measured way to support agriculture, which those who presided over the Petroleum Board thought is the mainstay of the Iraqi society and is what oil revenues should be used to support. But what happens is that the mere awareness of the existence of those rents was driving rent seeking. And at that time in Iraq, it took the form of nationalist movements, of leftist movements who were saying, well, it's wrong to use oil resources to keep them unused, to invest them in agriculture. We need to have our own industry. We need to have our own investment program, which are echoes that were heard across around the oil exporting nations at that time, and led eventually to the nationalizations of oil. And so Iraq gradually then became a petrostate as it gradually nationalized oil between 1960 and 1971. And it immediately then lapsed into the period of the petrostate. And the petrostate could be reduced to the formula of patronage and repression, which is a machinery of government that redistributes oil rents, that tries to buy, and as the previous example of the exclusionary coalitions, actually in Iraq there was no exclusionary coalition, it was an all-inclusive coalition. Saddam Hussein at some point had enough money to bribe the entire society when oil were high, and there's a very similar moment we are seeing in Iraq today, where there is enough actually oil revenues to buy everyone. Almost all the insurgents and all the militias are on the government payroll today, receiving some form of payment in an attempt to buy peace. And those who then oppose the system of redistribution or want to impose themselves as alternative distributors of patronage then become subject to repression. And again, oil resources and rents, if the country is sufficiently rich, are enough to sustain a very strong repressive apparatus. And that was a very similar, actually, the Soviet Union in a way could be viewed as one of those, as a petrostate in that respect, distributing equal measures of repression and patronage. On one hand, free healthcare, free education, and many other services, and on the other hand, very strong repressions for those who oppose the system. What happened, and this is often related to the fall in oil prices, is that there's not enough money to buy everyone, and actually the patronage and repression system exacerbates rent seeking. It's never enough, and you get a never-ending list of demands. I think we're seeing some echoes of that in the Kuwaiti parliament these days, whereby MPs are coming with ever newer privileges to ask for their citizens, from debt write-offs to credit card write-offs to everything possible. And so there's never an end to that, and they always, almost invariably, lapse these petrostates into predatory states when there is less and less patronage and more repression. And that's what we have seen in Iraq and the waning days of Saddam's, in the preceding the war with Iran. That's what we saw happening in the Soviet Union in the late 70s. And then eventually these states lapse into the senile stage when the state begins to fail and the whole system starts to collapse. And we've seen that, of course, in Iraq and Russia in 91 and after 91 in Russia and in Iraq after 2003. The state becomes very weak. The state becomes unable to deliver services or security. And what happens is the state's monopoly over oil rents, which was a constant theme throughout the whole process, begins to be challenged. And Chechnya was a very stark example of that because of the very specific nature of oil in that particular region that was susceptible to looting. It was very close to the ground. It was easy to refine in sort of backyard refineries. So you had a real, in Chechnya, oil was really lootable just like diamonds. And it was used to finance both sides of the conflict. In Iraq, over the last 5 years, we've seen elements of that, of siphoning of oil, of smuggling of large amounts of oil, of basically significantly eroding the state capacity. But in both cases, both in Russia and in Iraq, we've seen a stepping back from that. And a lot of that is related to the oil price. A lot of the cycle that I've described has something to do with the oil price. Again, I would be loath to reduce it to the oil price because I think there are many other elements there. But clearly the oil price plays a role, and we're seeing both in Russia and in Iraq a return to the petrostate model, a sort of a stepping back from the failed state situation and the twilight zone situation back into a petrostate model of patronage, of a combination of patronage and repression. But I wanted to come back to Iraq in a very briefly, just on the issue of the model of war and conflict that is associated with the various petrostate models or approaches to competition over resource rents. If you like, the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003 was carried out under the old war model of a geopolitical competition, of trying to control the territory and then change the regime and ensure security of oil supply or whatever other motivation was behind the conflict. And that was counterproductive because it led to it precipitated or accelerated the destruction of the Iraqi state and made it all very much more difficult to restore oil production, to restore oil supply, to rebuild the nation. Likewise, in Chechnya, there was a mismatch between the situation on the ground and what Russia tried to do there in terms of the invasion in 94 and in 99. But what happened in both cases that after some time there was a return to more constructive models of trying to build legitimacy and using different methods of fighting the conflict that are aimed at building legitimacy. And we've seen that in the surge, during the surge in Iraq. And we've seen some of that in Russia to a lesser extent, again in the waning months of the Chechen conflict. And that has allowed both conflicts to stabilize and to return to a state-building phase. I think that will stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Can I sit here? Do you want me? Hello, I'm James Russell from the Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey, California. I'm here representing my own views. So if you don't like what I have to say or think it's absurd and ridiculous, don't bother calling the president of the school. It won't do you any good. And by the way, Ron Soligo is going to tell you after I'm finished that everything I've said is wrong, so that's a good thing. But I'd like to thank Amy and Ron for inviting me to the event. It's great to get out and listen to what other people are talking about in this issue area. The reason I'm here is that Ron and Amy did a paper for us in connection with a project that we did for the long-range analysis unit at the National Intelligence Council that looked at this concept of the militarization of energy security. They were doing a national intelligence estimate on this topic at the time, and so we collected a body of people to sort of look at this concept and some various case studies in different regions and different countries as to whether this sort of concept of militarization has any validity at all. And not surprisingly, the upshot of the sort of conference or the gathering was in which we sort of tried to knit together economists and guns and bombs people and tried to get them into a single room together to talk about this issue. We had widely diverging opinions about the concept of militarization, where you guessed it, the economists tend to discount the prospect of militarization, and the guns and bombs people are not so sanguine. So what I want to try to do is cover some of the highlights in the paper, which I've co-authored with my colleague Daniel Moran, which is going to be in a edited volume in a book that is coming out at the end of June, published by Routledge, that Amy and Ron have contributed an outstanding chapter to. And the second thing I'll do is talk a little bit about how this framework of militarization might be applied to today's circumstance in the international energy markets, and to sort of walk you through, maybe a little bit tongue-in-cheek to get you kind of thinking about this a little bit, but to consider the prospect that deliberate actor calculations or miscalculations might lead to armed conflict in response to the functioning or perceived non-functioning of international energy markets. So, as I said, we asked authors to consider whether specific countries or regions would, quote, militarize their energy security, and secondly, whether this process would increase the likelihood of interstate conflict. So we got, as I say, the group of experts together, economists, political scientists, and the guns and bombs versus the economists sort of debate kind of played out. Security studies people, the guns and bombs people, of which I suppose it's fair to say I'm one, okay, we look at strategic problems and consider the prospect of how these problems could cause actors to arrive at a decision-making process that could cause an outbreak of war, the use of force, and a general breakdown in the international system. These prospects, that is to say, the prospects of general war, are pretty much discounted by economists, I think, who are for the most part intellectually wedded to the workings of the market and the stakes that all actors have in the orderly functions of those markets that invariably discount the use of force. And it has to be said that today, for example, the evidence is on the side of the economists, for example, who point to the absence of sustained armed conflict between developed states in the post-World War II era as part of a general acceptance in the developed world that war just doesn't pay. I'm not arguing that the world isn't a violent place, isn't a dangerous place, and that warfare isn't part of the sort of general structure of the system. I'm just sort of suggesting that warfare between and among the developed states is kind of generally accepted. And it is indeed, thankfully, sort of hard to imagine warfare on a scale today like that which existed in the world wars, a prospect that's, acknowledged in even the most alarmist of today's strategy documents. For example, those of you interested in defense planning can go and read the quadrennial defense reviews, for example. And the main purpose of these defense planning documents is to reorient the military capacities of our security apparatus to get them better suited to do things like counterinsurgency and irregular warfare. So this is simply an acknowledgement of what I've described of a sort of accepted view that large-scale conflict between and among developed states is regarded as unlikely. But if the economists have biases and confidence in markets and the ways in which states will react to these markets, there's also another series of bias in the security studies schools of thought, which is prone to believing that the worst will happen, which doubts the ability of individuals and institutions to act predictably in weighing the costs and benefits in their decision-making process on deciding when to use force. We in the security studies business also note that states have taken decisions in the past to go to war with their best customers. And last but not least, that second-order effects of decisions made by states can produce unintended consequences that in and of themselves force changes in the cost-benefit calculus of states in regarding their strategic circumstances. One of the celebrated instances of this latter phenomenon is the series of interactions, of course, between the United States and Japan that led to the United States to freeze Japanese assets in June 1941, which we in the United States saw as a way to incrementally increase pressure on the Japanese military to get them to cease their objectionable activity in China. The step resulted in a de facto oil embargo, which, while not initially realized by Roosevelt, is the decisive point at which the Japanese Army signed on to the Japanese Navy's plans to go to war with the United States. My colleague Dan Moran has done a wonderful book chapter on this case study for the book. The fact that strong states have been prepared to trust their energy security to the workings of the international market is testimony to their faith, right, in the efficiencies of those markets and to their belief that the costs of war aimed at controlling energy resources would be so great as to outweigh the benefits. The quote-unquote militarization of energy security assumes, however, that something will have changed that would cause major participants in that market to reject the calculation. High energy prices would be a necessary but not necessarily a sufficient motivation for such a change. In addition, governments would have to believe that the normal mechanisms by which prices adjust to changes in supply and demand had broken down or were on their way to doing so. Prices in almost any market, I'm in a room here with economists, so you already know all this, demonstrate three basic tendencies, right? Short-term volatility, medium-term momentum, and long-term reversion to the mean. The meaning of these terms varies depending on what is being bought and sold, but their operation is, of course, apparent across an enormous range of economic phenomenon. They represent collectively, quote-unquote, the self-modulating action of supply and demand, which is the economist's equivalent of the law of gravity. So from the point of view of those who want to make money in the marketplace, the first two tendencies, volatility and momentum, are of the greatest interest, since it is by mastering these that one has the best chance to buy low and sell high, right? But for strategists, for people thinking about the use of force, it's the third thing that is of most importance, the means reversion, since that is the longer-term mechanism that provides reassurance during periods when volatility and momentum carry prices and supplies to uncomfortably high or low levels. Means reversion does not require that prices fluctuate in perpetuity around a flat line, simply that their aggregate movements describe a relatively smooth trend, which may have a positive or a negative slope, but whose variance is markedly less great than that displayed by the short and midterm price changes. In other words, strategists like the means reversion. They like the predictability. The first task in our project to consider the militarization would be to identify events or forces that would cause governments to conclude that energy prices or supplies would not revert to some established trend. We posit that such events need not be dramatic in themselves. It's most likely that the militarization of energy security occurs as a small series of iterative calculations or miscalculations conceived in response to limited crises or opportunities, each of which, however, erodes the willingness of other participants to trust the market going forward. To speak of the militarization of energy security, it's necessary to imagine that such activity reaches a scale at which the normal operation of energy markets is compromised. The scenarios that we cover in this paper need not go so far as sort of to hypothesize the generic quote-unquote end of history, but they do envision strategic intervention on a scale which is not incidental, but calls into question the future vitality of markets as a whole. And we spin out in the paper a number of these different sorts of scenarios, and I'll just go through several of them. Direct seizure of energy assets by military means, military confrontation arising from competitive efforts to identify and exploit new energy resources, attempts to seize indirect control of energy assets through the creation of puppet states, military overthrow of governments whose outlook or conduct are deemed inimical to the functioning of energy markets, military protection or attacks upon the energy production and transportation infrastructure, including oil fields, refineries, pipelines, etc. And the list sort of goes on here. Now, I should hasten to add that there are those who argue that this phenomenon of militarization is in fact already well established, right, and has been underway for quite some years. The historian Andrew Basovich did a really wonderful paper several years ago in the Wilson Quarterly, for example, in which he argued that President Carter's threat to use nuclear weapons in response to any attempt by the Soviets, to advance to the Gulf from Afghanistan, that this touches off a sequence of events that sees the United States consciously mobilize its military establishment for protection of the Gulf oil fields, for example. Perhaps the more recent example of this, I would commend both articles to people interested in this. Michael Clare, up at the University of New Hampshire, I think, written extensively on this. Anyway, Michael did a book chapter for us, and he's just written an outstanding piece for the Nation, in which he argues that energy security considerations have provided an important impetus for our continued emphasis, for example, on building carrier strike groups, which sort of represents part of our Navy's desperate attempt to justify a hugely expensive shipbuilding program at a time when most countries around the world have pretty much given up on the idea of having any kind of Navy. The paper spins out, our paper, Dan and I's paper, spins out these arguments in greater detail, but what I want to do now is shift a little bit, again, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, to sort of applying this framework to today to get you all thinking about whether or not these ideas have any kind of merit or not. I would argue that the framework for analysis suggested by militarization is of interest in a couple of different contexts. First, there's a growing perception around the world that the international energy markets are no longer, in fact, functioning in accordance with the, quote, iron laws of the marketplace. The first of these is that rising prices provide a brake on demand and concurrently lead to the generation of new supplies. But as the chief economist at the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, recently commented in the New York Times, and I quote, "According to normal economic theory and the history of oil, rising prices have two major effects. They reduce demand and induce supplies. Not this time," close quote. In other words, demand for oil keeps going up, forecasted to grow by another 1.2 million barrels per day in 2008 to reach 87 million barrels per day and some change. Moreover, there's just no way to get around the fact that the non-OPEC suppliers have plateaued and will cease to be able to significantly increase production. In short, we're entering a period of resource scarcity for a variety of reasons which Amy, I'm sure, knows much more about than I, but which have to do with various kinds of capacities in the industry, which was unprepared to deal with the rate of demand increase as it gathered momentum over the last 5 years. The second feature suggesting a compromise, quote unquote, in function is that nobody anywhere is suggesting that the price of energy is going to go down anytime soon. Jeff Rubin, for an example, an analyst at CIBC World Markets, suggested recently in the New York Times again, that we're entering a period of, quote unquote, unprecedented scarcity that could produce $200 a barrel oil by 2012 or $7 a gallon gasoline here in the United States. What does this mean? What I'm suggesting here is that there is no quote-unquote means reversion coming that will see pricing revert to historical norms. The means reversion reverts inexorably up, creating the specter of the haves and the have-nots on the consuming side of the equation. So why are these 2 points important to my concept of militarization? First, it's these circumstances that tell us that the market may already be operating outside expected norms, right? Suggesting that the predictable and logical functioning of international markets is in fact already compromised. That being the case, if you want to accept this as a proposition, if states reach the conclusion that markets have ceased operating in accordance with these generally accepted principles, those states then lose confidence in the ability of the market to deliver in the present and in the future as they have in the past. Once this cognitive hurdle is leapt over by states, all bets are off, okay? As states take a more alarming view of the ways in which these compromised markets are not operating to their benefit or, in fact, are creating strategic circumstances that redound inexorably to their detriment. This creates the classic circumstance in the security studies community in which we refer to as, quote-unquote, preventative war, in which states perceive that time, for whatever reason, is not on their side and weighs the cost of using force more so in that favor. Nowhere are these considerations more important than in the United States, of course, which is perhaps alone in the world with a military that might be able to intercede on a scale that would systemically affect energy markets. And I should parenthetically note that I discount the ability of violent non-state actors to have these kinds of strategic interventions. And I also acknowledge it's ironic to mention the United States in this context, since one could argue that there is no country in the world today more economically, politically, and ideologically committed to the functioning of world markets. While the U.S. military presence in the Gulf, for example, is cited by many as an attempt to sort of take over the Gulf oil fields, I'd be among those arguing that we're using force or the implication of force to ensure the orderly functioning of markets for all concerned, including us, which is not really so surprising given the stake that we have in the orderly functioning of those markets. Having said all this, I would argue that we in the United States are also concurrently blinded to the truly strategic dimensions of the impact that world energy markets have had on global financial plate tectonics over the last 5 years. All right? In other words, while our taxpayers got saddled with $1 trillion plus debt to fight the war in Iraq, the Gulf states became global economic superpowers, courtesy of world energy markets, and they promised to get richer, unbelievably richer. Okay, and there are the host of statistics here about the incredible sort of wealth accumulation that's gone on in the Gulf. For example, Gulf sovereign wealth funds, now controlling assets estimated to be $1 trillion. Add in private, sort of individual holdings in the Saudi Arabia Monetary Agency, and you've got a $2 trillion portfolio right now in the Gulf. What I would argue is that there is a chasm today in the United States in what are the general public and political domains over the changes that have been created by the apparently orderly functioning of energy markets over the last 5 years. You could make the argument, and I do so a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but for the sake of discussion, you can argue that the same kinds of circumstances that are being played out here in the United States are creating an environment for the same kind of miscalculations here that existed in Japan in the 1930s. What I'm suggesting here is that once our politicians wake up and realize what has happened and will continue to happen, they're not going to like it. And let's face it, there are a lot of members in our political establishment that just don't like the fact that the Gulf Arabs are accumulating wealth at such an unbelievably fast rate. They don't like the prospect of wandering around these capitals, cap in hand, asking for help to solve economic problems, and they're not sure they like the prospect of $7 a gallon gasoline while the Gulf states are building underwater hotels and indoor ski slopes and building man-made islands. And they're not going to want to explain all this to the American people by urging them to look in the mirror, tighten their belts, and get back to work. You just look at our Obama and Clinton, for example, wandering around the Rust Belt, blaming people's economic problems on the free trade deals. Last week, provide another couple of examples of what I would argue are ominous indicators of how far behind the curve of self-realization we are at this point. First, the Israeli lobby got Senator Schumer to introduce a bill threatening not to sell arms to those bad old Saudis unless they increased oil production. Wow, I mean, I bet the Saudis are quaking in their proverbial boots, Imagine that. We might not sell them some new bomb kits, Second, we had an American president, sort of summarily taken out of Riyadh or sent out of Riyadh summarily by the Al Saud twice in the last 6 months. In other words, all I'm suggesting is we don't get the fact that markets and market functions change political realities and change political calculations of actors about the relative distribution of power in the international system. The Saudis and the Gulf Arabs get it, and we don't, right? The distribution of power has changed. Energy markets have changed the relative distribution of power. And our leverage in these capitals is limited as a result. And I would argue that the United States, the sort of political and public domains are in this weird sort of parallel universe where Alfred E. Newman and his Plane of What Me Worries sort of slogan seems to characterize, our outlook. But sooner or later, right, the perceptive chasm between the reality of markets and the reality of the distribution of power, that chasm will close. The public and our politicians are going to realize that the global financial center of gravity has shifted to the Gulf states, and when that happens, the prospect of militarization will, I fear, rear its ugly head.
That's a tough one to follow, isn't it? I don't think I can do justice to that. But I should start off by confessing to Mr. Chairman, I am now, and I've always been, a member of the economics profession. Those of you who are not old enough to remember the McCarthy years will not realize the similarity in that statement. Anyways, I am an economist. And as we've heard, I do have but this is Stoll, by the way. We should get the guy back there to. Good. So, let us start. The point of view is this notion from Michael Clare that was referred to, that who's written this book and has this quote here of no highly industrialized society can survive at present without substantial supplies of oil, and so any significant threat to the continued availability of this resource will prove a cause of crisis and in extreme cases provoke the use of military force. And he has in mind there, at least in that quotation, the idea of consuming countries, right, dealing with resource scarcity, having to perhaps resort to military means to secure supplies. There are other kinds of conflicts arising around oil that one might can think of. I'm going to kind of focus on this notion of sort of consuming countries being concerned about securing supplies to maintain their economic well-being. And I think very often some of this may have been provoked by the actions of China, for example, to go out and invest in oil resources around the world. And sort of the idea that maybe the Chinese, are grabbing up all this oil, and maybe we should be doing so too, or something like that. We live in a globalized economy, of one of relatively free markets, both in commodities and finance. This is a market system that has been a project of the U.S. and Western powers since the Second World War. So it's something that's been constructed over the last 60 years, 70 years, complete with a whole bunch of institutions and rules and regulations and treaties to fine-tune it and make it work even better all the time. So the world today is different, say, when the world was like in 1970, and certainly very different from after the First World War. We have had some experience with volatility in oil prices, again, particularly the 70s and early 80s, and we see that the markets have, in fact, dealt very reasonably well. I mean, there were certainly crises, there was hardship, but we were able markets have dealt with those price volatility. We have seen relatively little kickback from current rises in oil prices. Possibly it's because we are now more energy efficient than we have been. We're much more of a service-oriented economy. Oil is, at least in the United States, is much more increasingly a transportation fuel, which is an area where you can much more easily adjust to rising prices than you can, say, if it were an important fuel in the manufacturing sector. Professor Marty Feldstein this morning mentioned that he thought maybe the effect of high oil prices on consumer welfare has been delayed because of the home equity borrowing that funneled increased consumer expenditures at the same time. It may have offset some of the depressing effects of oil prices, but one did not see that the home equity phenomenon in other parts of the world, and of course those countries have not particularly been hurt by high oil prices so far. The belief in markets, as I say, is one that is learned, it's one that has to be cultivated, it's one that has to be completely nourished, constantly nourished, with, as I say, institutions and rules and regulations that are designed to preserve it. Nonetheless, there are, of course, many people around the world who still have memories or have an ideology which has always been very suspect of markets and have more faith in government control or government guidance of the economy. And whenever we have situations like we have now, there's this tendency, well, maybe we should have a national oil company because we really can't trust markets to to allocate oil resources in the future. And we see today China in particular, but also India and some other countries have promoted their national oil companies to, quote, secure oil resources for them. In the 1970s, many countries, including Canada and European countries, Japan, set up national oil companies for similar reasons. Most of those have been privatized. In retrospect, not very particularly successful in achieving anything that they were set out to achieve. In this globalized world, which complete with all its rules and so forth, it's highly unlikely, at least in the present time, to think that someone might actually defect from the system and undertake some of the policies that were mentioned in the previous talk. Without coercion, without occupation, without going back to the kinds of situations that existed in the colonial period, China is not going to get a special deal developing oil in a particular country. That country is going to demand the market price, whether it be in dollars or whether it be in development benefits. The rents that China is going to get are the rents that anybody else would get, perhaps with the exception of countries like Darfur, where if you're willing to take on sort of unsavory regimes, and you might earn a rent for doing so. Keep in mind that the existing system is one that's policed by the U.S. The U.S. still dominates the seas. So for countries who have special deals, if they were to have them, or if they were to do some of the things that were mentioned earlier, getting that oil to their country would be very difficult without the U.S. acquiescence. And finally, the cost of sort of breaking the rules or trying to go outside the market system, trying to get access to oil through military means would endanger those countries' relationships in other aspects of trade. And let's face it, oil is a small share of most countries' trade, or at least not a small, but a smaller trade. The cost of defection could be quite high for them. Finally, I guess we point out that when you look at various cases of war, that it's really hard to find cases where countries went to war over oil. It's true that in Japan, the case of Japan that was mentioned, people always say the proximate cause was the U.S. embargo on Japan of oil. But let's face it, I mean, the United States was not happy with what Japan was doing anyways, and that was probably going to end up with a confrontation eventually. I don't think you could argue that the war was caused by the conflict over oil. And there are a lot of countries which do have conflicts, by the way, over oil resources which have not gone to war. For example, Vietnam and China, Iran and Qatar, for example. And then there are countries that have gone to war, but not necessarily over oil. Iraq, Kuwait, these are countries which had oil, have lots of oil. This is not the case of consumer countries who are in great need to secure their economies and make sure that there's adequate oil to maintain their economies. And the Caspian, of course, is another area of Russia with Chechnya and Dagestan. The real test, it seems to me, was the 1970s when the Arab countries had the embargo, and we did not go to war. I mean, this was a clear provocation. It was an era where we did not have well-developed oil markets, which really meant that countries were physically cut off from oil. You couldn't get oil because the oil business was much more of a supplier-buyer kind of relationship without actively developed spot market. So even in that case, where the test I think was quite high, we saw that there was no particular war resulting from it. So I think our position typically is that yes, energy may enter into situations where there are other sources of conflict, but that energy itself, you'd have to look very hard to find cases where energy itself was the source of conflict. Particularly the situation, as I say, of consumer countries. I think part of the whole frame of resource wars and so forth may in fact reflect the fact that people are thinking of energy security in ways which perhaps are not so relevant today. This concept of what we mean by energy security is one that's really changed over time. Back in the 1950s, we were very much thinking in terms of military preparedness. This was the Cold War, and we wanted to make sure we had secure energy resources, or perhaps more specifically to make sure that the other guys, the communists, did not have access to the Middle East oil. In the 73, 74 period, with that embargo, now we're talking about worrying about these countries using the oil weapon, cutting us off, and how we could then become, how we need to become independent from that threat. In the 80s and 90s, with the low price of oil, suddenly our concerns shifted to more economic focus, worrying about the effect of oil price spikes, oil price shocks, how that might impact on the macroeconomy. It's only now in the post-9/11 period that we again see a slightly different focus, namely the fact that we are increasingly dependent on a particular part of the world which contains many actors, and in some cases some states, that are not particularly helpful or sympathetic with U.S. interests, and that our so-called addiction to oil is actually funding some of these regimes. This is a picture that I think Amy showed this morning, which is not quite complete on my diagram, my picture. Hit the button again. Oh, it's okay. Which shows that we are going to become increasingly dependent on the OPEC, and in particular a few countries, for the incremental oil that we're going to be needing in the next 25 years. But I should point out that it's not only, of course, because these countries are important in terms of incremental oil, all countries at the margin are going to be important to maintain the oil economy. So because we face different risks, I think that motivates our different definition of energy security. We're now concerned about the spillover from the Iraq War and how that might affect other conflicts in the region. We're concerned about our confrontation with Iran and what that might do in terms of if there are sanctions that cut off or reduce Iranian exports, or if something should happen to the Strait of Hormuz. We're constantly being harassed with attacks on oil facilities, not only in the Middle East, I might point out, even in the Western Hemisphere and in Africa as well. There are other kinds of actions which disrupt oil production around the world, whether they be strikes by oil workers motivated by demands for human rights or sharing of the rents or wishing to change the regime. You've got problems that David mentioned, for example, in South America and Bolivia, where you have struggles over various disparate subgroups in the country over resource rents. and political power. And they have, of course, had the effect of disrupting production and exports and investment in those countries, Nigeria and Indonesia, a couple of others. We have to be concerned increasingly with poor and failing states, which can lead to criminal gangs gaining footholds in those countries, producing black markets, and potentially financing terrorist networks. And even things such as the effect of severe weather and thunderstorms, as we learned through Katrina. We have a large proportion of our oil infrastructure located in a particular part of this country, and a well-targeted storm could cause a significant decrease in the output of our refineries and oil production. In addition to these sort of new concerns, which really are different from the traditional concepts of energy security, we do have this additional factor where oil and gas is increasingly being produced in fewer and fewer areas, particularly the Middle East and Russia, and that these countries, OPEC in particular with the Middle East, and Russia, which may or may not openly collude with OPEC, are going to exert increasing market power, and as mentioned by James, resulting in these huge wealth transfers from the industrialized countries to these oil producers. And with, of course, great transfers of wealth comes political power as well. For Europeans, I think Amy may have mentioned this morning, the growing concern is with Russia and gas. The Gazprom has systematically worked diligently to increase its monopoly power and control over all the gas reserves, gas resources that flow to Europe. It controls the gases produced in the Central Asian countries. It's acquired most of the transmission pipelines in Eastern Europe. It's investing in some of the gas producers of North Africa that supply Europe. It wants very much to buy the gas distribution assets in the EU. And we've seen from the experiences in Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and Georgia that Russia has been willing to use the energy weapon to achieve objectives. Now, one can argue about what those interventions really meant. Certainly, there were legitimate reasons for them to cut these supplies, the gas supplies. In the case of Lithuania, it's more cloudy, since it really was an oil pipeline that they shut down, and it was completely unrelated to the gas disputes with the other countries. But however, whatever motivation Russia may have had, clearly the Europeans have taken note and are quite concerned about their dependence on Russia. I noticed in today's newspaper, Gazprom issued a threat to the Europeans who are in the process of trying to break up the vertical energy monopolies that they have. And the idea was, if you go through with that, there may be consequences in terms of access to investment opportunities in Europe. We know that Russia is interested in trying to stop the eastward expansion of NATO. The Europeans are going to be more sympathetic because of that dependence. Some people have argued that Russia will use its energy monopoly in Eastern Europe to try to separate European and American interests. Well, how can we deal with these new security issues? And I think, as Amy pointed out this morning, it's diversify both geographically as to where your resources come from, and diversify amongst the energy mixes that are used. For Europe, clearly being tied to pipelines from the Soviet Union really limits their flexibility. And they are, of course, moving towards more LNG, partly because the Russians can't meet all their demand, but partly, I think, in response to the concerns over the potential power that Russia can exert on them. Although I should point out that Russia really needs to, Europe needs to interconnect its energy grids better so that energy can flow from country to country, whereas today, because of the historical nature by which those facilities have been invested and produced, countries are still somewhat separated. And finally, I might point out, as again, Amy, I think, made this point this morning, that consuming countries need to increase the flexibility of their energy-using industries and transportation systems, either by allowing these, having technologies which are dual use or dual fuel. So, for example, having automobiles which are flex fuel, ethanol, gasoline, or hybrids, electricity, gasoline, or at least by having a greater variety of types of automobiles out there so that we're not totally dependent on one particular kind. We need to continue to invest in energy efficiency technologies. That may require mandates. It's been very successful in the past. And finally, we need to increase the use of alternative fuels. Of course, nuclear and coal are the two ones that are in the largest available supply and the ones most likely to have a big impact on our imports of oil. But as my colleague Peter Hartley has mentioned on several occasions, the energy security aspects of using more coal may conflict with our desire to have cleaner environments and reduce CO2 emissions. So I think my time's run out, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. You've all been very patient. I do realize there's a special circle of hell that's reserved for the fifth presenter on a 5-person panel who goes over his time limit, and I will try to avoid that fate. The conventional wisdom out there is that China is engaged in providing economic benefits to a number of countries in return for at least the promise of getting resources from those countries. Oil comes to mind in particular, but other resources as well. And my question for the study that I did was really, does the pattern of Chinese positive economic actions from 1990 to the present basically support this interpretation? And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about how I precisely did the study because that would be really boring. But basically, along with some grad students, we collected data on Chinese economic events from Keesing's World News Archive, and in the case of Latin America, LexisNexis, and take a look at the data and look at patterns through time to see if what is happening out there, at least according to these data, matches the conventional wisdom. Now, we all know China is growing rapidly economically. If you rely on Chinese official GDP figures, since 1990, their growth rate has averaged at least 10% a year. I understand that there are people that have a little bit of problem saying, well, maybe those aren't completely accurate, but nevertheless, really rapid growth. And one key to maintaining that rapid growth is China getting a hold of the resources necessary to facilitate that. Many of the countries in the world that have these resources, oil or whatever, are developing. And so one can well imagine there are a number of possibilities for China to engage in positive economic activities with these countries. That is that, they sell them something cheap or provide a service or whatever. And this not only helps the developing country, but it also perhaps helps the Chinese economy as well. Well, is this what they're really doing? Or does it seem that way? I will tell you, put on my political scientist hat for just a second, there's been like oodles of studies by political scientists and others about sanctions, economic sanctions. People collect data on it, people talk about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's been almost no counterpart work done on positive economic events. I don't understand it, but what that meant was a lot of what I did was not so much to analyze the data, but actually have to go out and collect the data. And basically what we did was we looked for evidence of a clear and explicit economic agreement. So in other words, if there was a news report that China might be interested in investing blah, blah, blah in country X, that doesn't count. It had to be a very clear, explicit statement. I will tell you that most of the events that we found were related to high-ranking official visits by China someplace typically, or vice versa. So at the conclusion of this high-ranking official's visit, there'd be a report that China and the prime minister of whatever signed 4 agreements on this and that. That's the kind of things that we had. We found well over 100 such agreements during the time period we studied. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about how we did some statistical analysis, but roughly speaking, we looked at each region of the world separately. And our goal was to predict the number of positive economic events in a year, and taking into account the change in Chinese GDP, change in Chinese oil imports, and also looking at whether there was a trend through time. Okay, so what did we find? I do have a couple of pretty pictures, but for the first few things, it was so dull and boring, there was no pretty picture. If you look at North America, basically there's a slight relationship. As Chinese GDP grows, the number of positive economic events actually declines a little bit. Moving to Europe, basically the same thing, although statistically, boring, the relationship is even stronger than for North America. Africa. We found news reports of very few positive economic events. Now, that may be an issue with the sources more than with the reality. But nevertheless, even though there aren't that many, what you see is that virtually all of them have taken place recently. So it suggests that China is increasing its economic involvement in Africa. Okay. The Middle East. Oh, we got a picture for that one. Okay. And what you see here is there's a modest positive relationship between the change in Chinese GDP and the economic events. I will also tell you, not pictured here, there's a slight negative relationship between the change in Chinese oil imports and the number of economic events, positive economic events in the Middle East. Asia. The first thing to notice about Asia, I won't bore you with the details, but we used one source for every region but Latin America. If you look at all of those, that one source, almost 40% of all the events we found were with Asia. Now, this is not particularly surprising because we know for a variety of reasons that countries typically interact more with their neighbors than they do with countries at a great distance, okay? They also fight with their neighbors more than with but they do interact in every possible way more with their neighbors than with countries further away. And now so that's not too surprising. We do see a bit of a positive relationship between the change in Chinese oil imports and the number of economic events they initiate in Asia. But again, I think that part of why the Chinese are doing this may well be related to the desire for more resources, but they clearly are engaging economically for a whole bunch of other reasons as well. Okay. Now, the Middle East and Africa. There is a school of thought out there that says that, well, of course, if you're interested in oil, you want to interact with the Middle East, but that there can be problems there. And so a number of people have offered up the idea that China has, well, in their minds, backed away from the Middle East and is shifting more of its emphasis to Africa. And what I have plotted here, and I realize it looks mushy, are the number of positive economic events per year for both the Middle East and Africa. Now, there doesn't seem to be a gigantic pattern here, but if you do something very dumb and very simple, which I'm very prone to do, which is if you just chop the time period in half, what you see is the average number of Chinese events in the Middle East is basically the same in the first and second half. But it goes way up, or it goes up at least for Africa. This suggests to me something I'll return to in the summary, that it's not so much the Chinese are backing away from the Middle East in any sense, but they are increasing their involvement in Africa. Okay. Finally, Latin America. Again, we had to use a different source, and so The sheer numbers of events per year in Latin America, I am uncomfortable assuming that that can be compared to other regions with using the other source. But you can clearly see that there's a really dramatic increase in the number of positive economic events through time. Again, doing this dumb thing that I like to do, which is just divide the time period in half, there are between 3 and 4 times as many positive economic events towards Latin America in the second half of the time period as in the first. There's a very strong positive relationship in a statistical sense between the change in Chinese oil imports and the number of agreements in Latin America. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, I don't know, but let's review. Again, Asia is the region that has attracted the most economic interest from China, as defined in the kinds of data that I put together, okay? Not surprising, and while energy and other resources may be part of why China is doing that, I think we would all agree that China has a number of reasons for being involved in Asia and using economic tools, and so that's probably why they make such an effort there. Now, I didn't show you a separate slide on this, but basically I separated out all the countries in the data set that were top 20. I actually did top 10 and top 20 oil producers and oil exporters. There's no real sort of blindingly clear pattern that through time that China has increasingly had economic agreements with those guys, okay? They've had some, but it's sort of, if you look at those countries as a proportion of all the countries they're making economic agreements with, it stays about the same through time. China has reduced its positive economic events towards both North America and Europe. As China's oil imports increase, they increase the economic agreement slightly with the Middle East. That declines with in the Middle East. On the other hand, with their change in GDP, it goes up. So from my point of view, it nets out that China's positive economic events towards the Middle East have pretty much stayed the same throughout the time period that I'm studying. And there is an increase in involvement in Africa. Again, we're just starting to see that. And there's been a dramatic increase in China's economic involvement in Latin America. So, putting it all together, I think that the conventional wisdom, as is normally the case with conventional wisdom, is sort of right. Okay? There are some patterns in here that suggest that China's economic engagement is going towards countries that can help, give something to China, sell something to China that will facilitate their economic growth. But they're clearly doing other things. And there's a lot of additional work to be done. For example, if you thought about this for a second, the way I put this together, it treats every economic agreement as if it's worth exactly the same amount. Right? And I say, well, there were 5 this year, there were 10 the next year. That means there's twice as many. Well, there's twice as many economic agreements, but no 2 economic agreements are created equal. So one of the things I obviously have to grapple with is a more refined way of looking at economic agreements. It's quite possible that if I did that, I'd see a completely different set of patterns. But that is, as they say, for another paper. And thank you very much.
Some audience participation and some discussion among the panel. I'm going to start with what we call the Amy Jaffe stiletto question for James, right? So excuse me in advance, right? But you made a very, very compelling case, and if I understood you correctly, you're sort of predicting that the United States might be the actual aggressor, which is sort of in line with, the sort of blood for oil coterie. On the left. So I want to ask you a question, okay? Given the fact that we're a democracy, and given the fact that we can make choices as a society, so in other words, the Pentagon doesn't get the vote by itself, do you think that average Americans would vote to have a military draft for young people, not on a volunteer basis, but everybody has to serve, or would they drive less if that was the choice?
On a draft. I'll tell you that.
Okay, so would you agree with my contention that if it turned out that our choice was to have a draft, because of course we're stretched thin, so to do these kind of military operations you've described to attain our oil, we would have to have a draft, and given the fact that we all know we could actually drive less.
I don't accept the second half of that we could not do the military operations without the draft. I don't accept that, but But, sorry.
But we'd have to go into more than one country?
Well, the point of my argument is that what we have is the confluence of a series of circumstance which produces a decision-making environment which casts militarization as a viable option.
But I'm telling you that to have that option, I have, like, if you look at the debate about the Iraq War, for example, so I have to be presented with the decision tree. Do I want to continue to commit that level of troops, or do I want to drive less? Because that's really ultimately the decision tree. And if we had more sound policy and I had to choose between whether I was willing to stomach the inconvenience of an electric car
But I would,
and have a draft, then the choice tree becomes even less difficult.
but I would argue that the Iraq debate is the wrong one to look at because there was no debate effectively in Iraq, and there was no deliberative interagency process which looked at the should we do this question. The interagency process, as has been documented elsewhere, was effectively hijacked by, the Vice President's office. They never looked at the should question. The could question was the only one they looked at, which was basically signed, sealed, and delivered to the American people, who seemed to have no sort of objections to this, as long as it wasn't in their backyard. That is to say, as long as they didn't have to sign up for the draft and they could have their volunteer force go off and fight and die.
I wanted to challenge James on the assumption that you're making here is that these high oil prices are going to continue and this great transfer of wealth is going to sort of a permanent feature. I'm reminded that it took roughly 10, more than that, maybe 12 years between 73 and probably almost 15 years now to think about it, to the collapse of the oil prices. We're only into this thing about 5 years now, so there's still time for the story to play out. But let me point out. Hang on. I saw in the paper today. Somebody said the oil price would go to $200. Well, at $200 a barrel, I mean, there are so many options out there, right? Not only drilling off our coasts for conventional oil, but coal to liquids. There's a lot of options, right? It's just not going to happen. It's not, the price cannot be sustained there. Maybe in the very long term, but not in the intermediate term.
Your argument and your point is the economist's argument, which is that trust the markets will deliver, they will deliver supplies, they will bring prices down to the mean reversion, life goes on, the future will be like the past and we'll be happy. What I'm sort of suggesting is that when circumstances arise in which the political leadership of the state starts to doubt, right, in the sort of efficacy of those market mechanisms continuing to work in the future as they have in the past, it changes the decision-making calculus of the state in question. And for me, and I said at the outset, I was delivering a little bit of this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but there is some evidence out there that the market has in fact been compromised. That is to say that it is not functioning normally right now, which is that higher prices are not producing a break in demand and they are not producing additional supplies. And the prospect is that they are not in fact going to deliver the mean reversion, the three sort of iron laws of market functions. I'm suggesting to you, if you have these three things piling up like this in this kind of order over time, that decision makers and the political environment eventually gets it. I'm arguing in the second half of my presentation that we are in a period right now where we are clearly clueless about this. We don't get it in our political and public domains. But eventually, at some point in time, the chasm closes and we do begin to understand it. Schumer shouldn't have introduced his bill, threatening not to sell the Saudis arms. He should have introduced a bill urging them to buy more. I mean, if he'd have gotten it, so to speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the whole petroleum markets or energy markets not functioning, because I think that this should not be taken too far, this argument. There's clearly a malfunction, dysfunction in the global energy market. There are definitely ways to make them smoother. There definitely have been more volatile and there have been huge lags. But as I understand, OECD oil consumption has actually
It's
been
falling.
falling despite economic growth. They have been having, which is really, I mean, this gives OPEC producers nightmares. This is the sort of long-term stuff that can produce low oil prices over an extended period of time, and there are indications that even Chinese oil demand could be going down. So there is a lag in the way the markets react, and this time the lag has been longer. This has not been a spike. This has been a sustained rise, but that doesn't mean that the markets are over. Just like people thought the previous housing booms and so on were going to go on forever. But I do agree with the premise that with one of the main premises that you're making, which is that there is some irrational decision making here at place. Politicians may very well decide that the markets are not going to revert to normal and may very well act irrationally or not in the best interest of their people. And this is why there's an obligation to show that markets actually will eventually work.
I was just going to make a similar kind of comment, which is that there are other policies too that can adjust in these circumstances. So, for example, some of the high demand right now and the persistence of that high demand despite the prices is because of lots of subsidies in lots of countries. So those subsidies become increasingly expensive, and those policies can be forced to adjust. Or another one here is that it can put pressure, as Ron mentioned, on the attitude towards CO2. So, in North America, there are lots of very high carbon, unfortunately, but fossil fuels available, not just coal, but tar sands and the oil shale. And there are other margins on which you can adjust. So other policies can be. Doesn't necessarily military response is not necessarily the only response.
And one of the things I think that we argued in the study that I didn't make that point this morning was that we actually include in the study, we have our lists of risks, and if you read the executive summary, we go through each one of them. We actually have climate policy as a risk, and the reason we have it as a risk is that part of your statement that the energy market isn't 100% reacting is because you have investment uncertainty. So in other words, if I was a Shell or a BP and I know that I'm going to be able to produce as much shale as I find and produce, at $200, well, hey, I'd be out there, heating the hell out of the ground and then letting it liquefy off. But if I'm going to be constrained from doing that by a carbon tax or a veiled carbon tax through cap and trade, then I have to consider that investment. And we've seen that in the cancellation of coal plants all through 2007, where companies had planned investments and they canceled them partly because the banks won't finance any construction of something that doesn't have a carbon plan. So some of these things, I think, if you listen to the presidential candidates, and I had a slide on that, some of these things, in my opinion, are going to get resolved. Even if it's just to take the uncertainty away so I can price in the carbon, because, if you were correct, and if I'm correct about the uncertainty, if I remove the uncertainty, even though it's going to make it more expensive, I'm still going to get the investment if I take away the uncertainty.
Yeah. Let me just, as a person that studies international conflict, the first thing is war is a very rare form of behavior, fortunately, okay? And that, so it seems to me that, and I guess I would side a little more with James on this, to the extent of saying, yeah, it's unlikely. But, think about it. Let's go back to Iraq. Let's go back to Iraq after 1991. Basically, we had 12 years of what amounted to a containment policy on Iraq, right? In other words, bad things are happening in Iraq, but basically what we'll try to do is keep bad things from happening outside the borders. Okay? And, I thought, and I think a lot of people thought, well, it would be nice if we could solve this problem another way, but this appears to be working, and we just have to be patient, and change will come about internally, and things will be better. Well, then we had a group of people come into office that one can argue, well, they, I suspect, felt that containment wasn't working as well as other people did, but they just didn't want to have the patience. So, if we'd been it is a rare behavior. I don't think it's likely to happen, but I think we need to think about it a little bit, because there are circumstances in which governments could decide that typically it's not a good choice. Now, these people may have thought it was a good choice, but typically when war comes out, it's like it's not a good choice, but it's a best of a bad set of choices. So I don't think we can ignore the possibility.
Yeah,
I'm a political
and
scientist.
just, aren't you glad I came? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm
That's
not
why we
arguing.
invited you.
I'm not arguing for war, just lest anybody come with it. All I'm arguing is that economists tend to discount this as a possibility, and I'm suggesting that, that it's not as distant a possibility as you might want to think. That's all.
On that subject, I didn't see you mention it, but I think I saw on PBS an American Experience type of show that indicated that Nixon had done some planning on taking over the Saudi oil fields in the first 70s. I mean, but that's
No, there is a history on this that dates to the 50s. When President Truman, in fact, commissions a study on ways to address American military conventional inferiority to the Soviets at the end of World War II, and by which time, of course, the oil center of gravity, the energy center of gravity, is shifted to the Arabian Peninsula, and they commissioned a study on how we are going to deny the oil fields to the Soviets, which includes, among other things, quote unquote, radiological devices and putting concrete caps in oil wells. And Nixon, again, looks at this, I don't know how seriously, Amy maybe know more about it than I do, but it was looked at at certain points. Yeah.
That's not my major point. My major point to you, though, is I understand your major point is the concern is that the political leadership stops believing in regression towards the mean. But for yourself, if you get hair, when you get to the age where you have hair, the color I do, you have a different view on things. I've been in the energy industry for 30 years, and it seems to me that what we have known to a moral certainty in day one is turned upside down inside 5 to 7 years. I just don't think the conventional wisdom, since I've been in the energy industry, has held for much longer than that. And so what we know to a moral certainty today, in 5 years, we're going to say, what dopes we were. How could we have thought that? And anybody who thinks it's going to $200 a barrel and is going to stay there more or less indefinitely, you got to believe that guy is less than 40 years old. If he's 40 years old or older, he can't believe that.
Some gray hair. I got some gray hair up here.
I would kind of take exception with the idea that somebody's acting irrational, namely the Saudis. It seems to me the Saudis are acting extremely rational. It's the United States that is acting irrational. From the Saudi standpoint, all they are doing is trying to find out what is the price at which demand begins to level off. Why should they sell something for $80 if they can get $120? I mean, that'd be stupid. And so, what if they had 30 years to realize what happens if you overinvest in oil production facilities that you don't need, so they're not going to do that. But onto the point of militarization, speaking to the economist, it seems I'm not that much of a historian. I'm an engineer. But it seems to me normally big wars start when people have been preparing for them, but they start on something small and should have been insignificant at the point, but then it blew up into something. And so if, particularly in the United States, I think we have a sense of entitlement. And so if things aren't going our way, we'll get a bigger wrench. Whether we have the troops or not, we may be preparing, and then something can happen, and then all hell breaks loose. So I would not be quite so sanguine that the markets will solve all of our problems, although I believe in free markets.
I want to suggest that the disagreement between James and Ronald has already been taken, that it was thoroughly thought out during the period between 2001 and 2003, and that our incursion into Iraq, in fact, was a military action taken for that reason.
Well, I'll tell you my view, and James might want to take a different view since he was sort of closer into the military establishment than I. But I did participate in some of the workshops on the preparation for if we're going to war. And I can tell you, I was on a panel that involved people from the humanitarian agencies, and there was a discussion about whether or not the U.S. military had enough gas mask equipment to handle what would happen to the Red Cross and others if there was a release of weapons of mass destruction. So I, for one, believe that we had an intelligence failure, and that it wasn't just, Dick Cheney woke up in bed one night and said, oh, I'm going to make something up so we can go attack Iraq about oil. And it was in the fervor of September 11 that no one in the U.S. public and the New York Times and the media and interest groups stood up and said, geez, but, show us the money, show us the money. I really don't think that, if you go back to 2001, the price of oil was actually falling, demand was down because of the curbed airline travel and other travel. People were staying home, people wanted to be with their relatives, and the economic situation at the time was not favorable, and so therefore we weren't really in an oil price rise situation, and you had to put yourselves back, and I'm happy to admit this in front of the audience since I made these dire predictions about the market. You'll know I could be wrong. In 2000, it wasn't clear that Hugo Chavez was going to wreck up the Venezuelan oil industry, and so the Vens were still planning to go to 5 or 6 or 7 million barrels a day. Had they stuck with that plan and the Saudis had responded as they had said they would, price of oil would be a lot lower today. Venezuela's at 2 million barrels a day instead of 7. So in 2000, 2001, we were in a sort of falling oil price mindset, not the other way around.
Quite aside from prices, I think that you were part of a relatively public discussion in that run-up, and that the decision was taken in Mr. Cheney's office.
At that time, I was saying oil prices would go down. And I was on the record in Foreign Affairs, and so I was deadly wrong, but that was sort of my view at the time.
Yeah, I'm in a position of agreeing with almost everyone here, and in that I think that first of all, I'd like to say that the reversion to the mean that James discussed is a mean of a non-competitive market, since the 1800s. So we're in this market where we imagine that the market is or it is not working. Well, it's never really been working. You can still lift oil for $3 and sell it for now 100 and whatever it is, 29. So that's not a competitive market. But it wasn't competitive at 17 either. This assumption creep that was discussed, that James just introduced about these worries about supply and what we would do to deny the Soviets, these quantity-based conceptions, I believe, are at the root of our problem in the Persian Gulf, in that we dragged this stuff into the Carter Doctrine once this fear of the Soviets cutting off the straits, which I would totally agree with Professor Saligo, is very unlikely. It's not a cakewalk from Afghanistan to the Straits of Hormuz, as the Soviets, of course, they never got out of Afghanistan, but yet we, under the Carter Doctrine, parked our force there beginning in 1984, and it's been a steady upward climb, finding new ways to use this force and imagining we could choose the winner and deny deny the country that was exerting this threat. And none of so it's all been a fantasy, and that we're now we're in this situation where we've embarked on this war in 2003 for almost no reason at all.
In some circumstances, oil is not the excuse, or securing energy supplies is not the excuse, but it's a good alibi. And I think, particularly in the case of Iraq, I think the notion that without the unspelled notion that maybe the war in Iraq will have the added benefit, the sort of icing on the cake of at least the war paying for itself, as Mr. Wolfowitz suggested, or that at least there will be a better supply of oil going forward. It was a sweetener. It reduced resistance to the war. It created sort of a moral complicity with the public about it. So people who opposed it, who had not very comfortable with it, it made it simpler. And I think this has been a historical thing. So for the engagement, military or otherwise, in the Middle East may have been motivated, and is certainly motivated by a plethora of other factors. And oil was always a sweetener. It made it easier to interfere. I just wanted to comment on something about Saudi Arabia's pricing policy. I think the Saudis are smart enough to realize that the $100 oil and even a $70 oil is not in their interest. Indeed, the lesson they learned from the boom and bust of the 70s and 80s is that high oil prices can create significant shifts in oil demand in the long term. And that is much more dangerous for them than the windfalls they are gaining in devalued dollars today. Saudi Arabia is most likely to end up with oil in the ground that they will never sell. They have a very long-term horizon, and so they have the most interest in oil remaining the main source of energy forever. And for that to be the case, it's better for them for oil to sell at $30 a barrel than 100, because 100 then it definitely creates a huge, incentive to alternative energies and other sources.
Okay, on that note, though I will mention, I was out in Kuwait in January, and we were talking about a group of people were talking about the debate about whether Kuwait should expand its resources or not in the parliament. And somebody made an offhand remark that there were many people in the parliament who are against that. And so later, when we're just quietly in a corridor, I said, I don't understand, why would anybody in the parliament in Kuwait at 100, then it was $110, be against bringing on a new oil field? I mean, just found money, right? And it was explained to me that there was this belief in peak oil, and so the oil will be worth more later, so we shouldn't produce it now. Right, and so I'm not saying that, I'm sure in Saudi Aramco they're not sitting and making that analysis, but in other circles in the Persian Gulf, maybe some people have that same view. So let's break for coffee, and then we will come back. Our last panel is going to talk about sort of implications for U.S. policy.
Are you leaving?